Module 5. George Eliot was a participant in a seminar that I presented at the Gramercy Park Hotel in New York. That was in the 90s. George's problem was that he never seemed to get anywhere. He had a job that paid enough to get by on, but he just couldn't seem to get out of the rut that he was in. He lived from paycheck to paycheck like a lot of his friends. But one of the fellows that he grew up with seemed to have it all. Money, an estate-sized house, a luxury car, a beautiful wife, seemed to have everything. Now, George had a fair job, a loyal wife, 2 kids, a vacation every year, average house, and he was in good health. But George believed his bad luck was keeping him from the good life. And that's what he really wanted, what he considered to be the good life. He wanted to know, would past life therapy help? He was envious of his friends who seemed to have more and weren't any smarter or better educated than he was. Well, I thought he lived okay, but he wasn't satisfied, and he was the only one who could really set the criteria, let's say, for his life. So I thought, well, can't hurt, like I tell most people. Before we went into a past life immersion, I used George as a demonstration of how to utilize something different, the power of a future life to offset a harmful belief. Actually, I was looking to change George's belief. Now, the class size was about 50 people. I called out for a volunteer, and George, of course, came to the front of the room. He went into a deep meditation and waited for guidance. Here's what I said to him. Now, we're sitting in the front, George is sitting in front of the room. I'm standing next to him. His eyes are closed. He's in a meditation. And there's a microphone in front of his mouth. And so everybody could hear every word he says, which is what I wanted because this was a training class after all. And here's what I said. George, as you know, the past is a memory. It's over, gone. It only remains active in your mind. And George, deep in meditation, nodded. The future, I said, is a fantasy. It hasn't happened yet. Not at this dimension. The power that you have to choose and to change is now. Your point of power is now, not in the future, not in the past. However, to activate that power, you must visit the future and you must visit the past. You're having problems at present because you believe that you're a failure as a man. You believe you're a failure as a husband and as a father. You told me this yourself. George nodded again and looked kind of sad. We're going to change that belief that you're a failure, George, because until you do, you're going to remain exactly where you are right now. That's one of your main problems. You are where you are because you believe you are. You believe you're a failure. You told me that. Where does that belief come from? George, still deep in meditation, didn't reply, just shrugged and looked even sadder. I continued. Well, I'm going to let you in on a secret, George. You know, it doesn't matter where the belief comes from. It may have come from your childhood. It might be a small, insignificant cause. Or it may have happened when you first went out into the world. It may have happened in a past life. What we're going to do now is to neutralize that belief, the belief that's telling you that you're not good enough. You're going to pick a future self of yours who is good enough, a self of yours that's in the future, a self that is not only good enough to do the things that you dream about, but who is successful and more importantly, who is happy with his position in life. At that point, George relaxed, and I counted him down even further by counting from 10 to 1 again. Pretty soon, George was very, very relaxed and very deep into meditation. And here's what I said next. And this is pretty much what's on the next module, which is a meditation module that you'll be doing. George, imagine that there's a brightness about you. In front of you is a bright white light, pretty much like a fog that's filled with brightness. This bright fog is a doorway to a future time, a future you. There are many future selves of yours. Each one has chosen a different path. The path that each self has chosen is based on belief. If the self has a belief of being unworthy, he's going to choose a path that is most likely to produce that effect. But that's not the path that you're going to choose. What path would you take if you were successful at everything that you did? What path would you take if you were successful and happy with your position in life? Now that's the path that you're going to choose when you walk through the light. When you go through the light, that bright fog, you will be involved with an event, a future event involving you. It's going to be a positive event because your belief is such that you will be attracted to a self who is successful and happy with his family, happy with his friends, happy with his work, and happy with his place in life. Okay? Good. Now, imagine, George, that you're walking into the light. You are now in the light. And now step through and greet your future self, the future self of yours that could be. Your future self has a strong belief in his self-esteem and the confidence that he can do anything and do it well and successfully. Your future self made different choices. Choices a person with a strong belief in himself would make. When you walk through the light, you will be with your future self observing. Just observe what's going on. Kind of walk through what you sense, what you see. Your future self will be doing something. It doesn't matter what he's doing. You'll simply observe the scene and not comment, not judge what you sense and see. Now I'm going to count from 1 to 3, and at the count of 3, you'll walk into the light, through the light, into a scene, a future scene that is taking place. 1, 2, 3, begin. After explaining what was going to happen to George, I helped him to get to the meditation state, and I counted him just like I just said into the light. George was in front of the class, comfortably seated. His eyes were closed as he meditated. After a while, it was a little more than 5 minutes, he squeezed his eyelids together, opened his eyes, and smiled. "Wow," he said, "that was something. I kind of saw me driving a Bentley," he said. "I was all dressed up with a great suit and I think I had a silk shirt. I think I was driving to pick up my wife or a friend. It seemed so real. What's next?" Well, the idea of going into the future life is to neutralize and wipe away the belief that George was a loser. Belief is generally the chief culprit in keeping a person from getting the things that they want. By going to a future self who is successful and has different beliefs, George's subconscious sees that it is possible, and a chink appears in the armor that was keeping him from setting goals that he subconsciously believed were impossible for him to attain. When you do the future self, your future self, you acknowledge the problem. And then when you do the past self, as we'll do again in the later model, you wipe away the cause of the problem. Well, George went into another meditation. This time, this was a demonstration. After all, we did them both together. And this time, after walking through the light, he went to a past life. He reported that he was in a forest and a bunch of horsemen, apparently from some military or other, galloped by. He heard voices and shouting and horses snorting, even thought he got a whiff of a sour aroma. As he was instructed, George just observed the scene, and that was it. The entire session with George took about, maybe 30 minutes, and it changed him. When he left the class, he had a new belief. The belief was, I can. Simply that. But what a powerhouse there is in those two words. George changed. He showed up one day a few months later, the next time I was in New York, to bring his wife to the class and to sit in on the seminar. I almost didn't recognize him. He walked straighter, spoke with more authority and confidence, Self-esteem just oozed out of him. He brought his wife to the class so that she could learn and use the power of past and future life immersions. George asked me if I would be telling the story of the mud hen. I told him that I would. It's something that I never neglected. It's one of my favorite stories. It sums up very nicely why some people never seem to make it in life. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a man who made his living selling newspapers on a downtown street corner. That was during a time when people did sell newspapers on street corners. Well, this man, his name was Bobby. He lived in a damp, single-room apartment that was too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. He was aware of his newspapers, his simple room, his ill-fitting second-hand clothing, the simple food he ate, and little else. Other people he knew lived differently, but it was difficult for him to imagine that other world. How could a mud hen hope to aspire to the grandeur of the eagle, slowly circling higher and higher, working on a swirling updraft, wings spread proudly in magnificent flight? Our mud hen's name was, as I've said, Bobby. And every morning when he woke up, eyelids still clogged by the effects of sleep, his first thought was to see himself standing on his corner, hawking newspapers. The visualization was always the same. Half a dozen papers under his left arm and a single newspaper held in his right hand as he shouted out the headline, shouting it in a raspy voice, hoarsened by years of abuse. Some mornings, still half asleep, he'd see a customer give him $1 and say, "Keep the change." On these mornings, he'd open his eyes and smile. It'd be a good day. As he ate a simple breakfast of biscuits, bacon, and coffee, he would think about how many newspapers to buy. If he really felt good, he'd order half again his normal quota. If he didn't feel that good, he'd order only half as much. Seeing a beautiful woman on her way to work, he'd visualize himself selling her a paper. Seeing a well-dressed man, he'd think, that one's got to be good for a 50-cent tip. If he saw a policeman, he'd see himself handing the officer a paper, and the policeman smiling at him. Passing a stockbroker's office, he'd imagine the brokers busily engaged in reading one of his newspapers. He related everything to newspapers. Newspapers were his life, his world, his reality. Everything he was conscious of, he would in some manner relate to newspapers. He believed himself to be a small, raspy-voiced failure of a man, capable of selling only newspapers. And so he was, because he only accepted information that reinforced the belief. He enclosed himself in a structure that he himself had built, brick by brick by brick. Every time he bought himself a worn-out pair of second-hand pants, he added a brick. Every time he brought home a stale, crusty, day-old bread to save money, he added a brick. Every time he sold a newspaper, he added a brick. And in the mornings, as he slowly pushed himself out of bed and saw himself selling papers and being tipped for his efforts, and in the evenings, when he thought over the day's events and smiled because of the tips or sulked because of the torn papers, it was then that he added the mortar. And so he lived, and so he died, never knowing that he was an eagle all the while, an eagle bound with the most senseless chains of all, those of limited awareness. What good is being an eagle if you believe yourself to be an earthbound mud hen? Believe yourself to be a mud hen, and you'll not only see one in your mirror, you will view the world from that perspective. Belief is a powerful force. But what exactly is a belief? Here's a simple definition. A belief is mental acceptance of something, some idea, as being true. Now, that acceptance can be based on trust for an authority, on reason or prejudice. A belief can also be a thought or series of thoughts that have been programmed or conditioned by outside agencies. Even when the acceptance isn't supported by reason, a belief causes the individual to act as though the thing were totally reliable. Many beliefs that seem to make no sense at all appear to have been instigated early in childhood or during an event in a past life. That's what past life therapy is for, to change harmful beliefs. Bobby, the mud hen, couldn't imagine a future self. He was stuck in the present. His future was as immutable as his present. But if he had the opportunity to view a possible future self, he might just have pulled himself out of the quagmire he was in. You, however, have the opportunity to see a future self, a self that might be, a self that could be. The next module will be for you to concentrate on what could be a future you, a possible you. Hopefully, after you go through this program, a probable you. So relax, be comfortable, and listen to the meditation, and go into the meditation on the next module.